It was a very interesting presentation about your experiences and about the future projects, and that will help us a lot in our region. So thank you again. And I invite you for to watch the next panel on technological incorporations in the public health system in Brazil, what to expect in 2022. Álvaro Puccinelli is a scientific director of the Brazilian Society of Clinical Research, is going to moderate this panel. Álvaro, thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you for everyone watching us online. It's an honor to be here. This is going to be a very interesting panel talking about specific aspects for laboratory research regarding the incorporation of new technologies. We have been working a lot on that. Well, this panel will have 5 speakers. The first speaker is going to talk about tuberculosis, Dr. Erica Chimara. Afterwards, we will have Dr. Marianne Stefani talking about a rapid test for leprosy. Then we will have a talk about the duo test of HIV and syphilis, Daniela Cristina Soares. Afterwards, we will have Pamela Gaspar from the Ministry of Health talking about chlamydia and gonorrhea. And then Dr. José Levy from the University of São Paulo will talk about HPV. So thank you all. I would like to hand it over to Dr. Erica for her presentation. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me at such an important event. I would like to thank Dr. Carlos for inviting me and Dr. Flavia as well. And thank you all for the opportunity to show you a little bit of the work that we do here. Let me share my screen with you. 1 second. Please let me know if you can see it in presentation mode.
Assim, doutora, pode continuar.
Yes, go ahead. Okay, so we will talk about the incorporation of a test at the public healthcare system in Brazil that was recommended by the WHO, and it's going to be incorporated here in Brazil. So what are the expectations of the service? So the infection caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis is a curable and preventable disease. So we have 85% of people that develop the disease treated successfully within 6 months. To conduct the diagnosis, we have basic tests. A test of Bacillus copy developed over 100 years ago. We also have rapid molecular tests, which are recommended by WHO since 2010. And we have the culture test that takes about 8 weeks to provide the results, but it's still the gold standard. So now in 2020, we have data reported by WHO showing that almost 10 million people fell ill with TB. We've had a huge problem because of the pandemic, because there was a gap of people undiagnosed or not reported. We've had 214 people that died with HIV and 1.5 million people who died from TB. The strategy established by WHO to end TB is to define latent infection of TB. So we have to make the diagnosis to fight the disease as a whole. So latent infection is an immune response to the antigen, but there's no evidence of the disease. So people do not have symptoms, but they are at risk of getting ill. between 5 and 10% of people with ILTB, if not treated, will develop TB throughout life. There's no gold standard to identify this infection, and most of, or the biggest difference between ILTB and TB is the absence of disease. So how do we do the diagnosis? We conduct clinical, radiological, and laboratorial assessment. We have tuberculinic proof at the laboratory, which is the intradermis inoculation of a purified proteic derivative, which will measure the cellular response to the antigens. So we have a read 48 to 72 hours after the application. And so we need 2 appointments to conduct this test. The interferon gamma release assay is an indirect test that will detect the infection, detecting the production of lymphocytes considering certain proteins produced by M. tuberculosis. So we might have a positive, negative, or undetermined result. We have seen the benefits of IGRA test compared to PPD. One of them is that the IGRA test is conducted in a single day. So the patient goes to the healthcare clinic and does not have to come back. With the PPD test, the patient has to go twice because the technician has to perform the read and interpretation of the result. IGRA has a high sensitivity, a high specificity compared to the PPD test. The PPD test can be variable in people vaccinated with the BCG, with the TB vaccine. We have a false positive results there. So we have some advantages on the IGRA test. This is a test recommended by Conitec in Brazil in October 2020. It was recommended to detect a latent infection by M. tuberculosis for patients living with HIV, reminding that they have to have a TCD4 above 350 cells per MM3, and people candidate to transplant of stem cells. It's important to test these people, but right now, Conitec does not recommend the IGRA test for this population, but the evaluation is undergoing. So quantiferon TB is a test for in vitro diagnosis of this infection using a blood sample. It uses a set of peptide to stimulate the cell in the blood, but these proteins are present in some cells. So when they're not present in BCG strains, is the cause of having some false positives because these proteins might be in M. kansasi or M. marinum strains. So people infected with M. tuberculosis have lymphocytes in the blood that will recognize these mycobacterial antigens. So this test has to be performed in 4 tubes for positive control, negative control, and here they will primarily detect CD4 T cell response. So here we have the difference between the IGRA and the PPD test. The detection of interferon gamma will be performed by the ELISA test to identify this antigen proteins. So the detection and quantification will be the base of the test. SUS has then incorporated the IGRA test in November 2020, 1 month after being approved at CONITEC. So the Ministry of Health is working on implementing this test in the laboratory network. And in August this year, they required all coordinations working with TB of a proposal for a network, laboratory network. I'm coordinator of the network in São Paulo. And so we are checking all the laboratories to see if they have the proper structure to conduct these tests. So what are the needs that we have? There are several requirements. This is a very important implementation, and we have to evaluate key aspects in order to be successful. So we thought about implementing a pilot program together with GENSUR and other coordinations of TB programs and HIV programs to implement the IGRA test. So what are the minimum requirements? The ability to collect blood samples, the guarantee that there are logistics to quickly transport the blood samples to the laboratories in a proper time. The laboratories have to be centralized in order to optimize the use of the kit. And we also need laboratories that can process and read and deliver the results in a way to have the technicians and work according to quality standards. In the laboratories, we have to have equipment and inputs to perform this test. It's not such a simple test regarding infrastructure. So the pilot project that we implemented in the state of São Paulo has as a goal to evaluate the main bottlenecks to implement such a test in the diagnostic routine. So as we've seen, it's important that the diagnostic is conducted with tests that are specific. But once we start using this test in the laboratory network, we have to evaluate the whole population that will be studied and also the infrastructure existent to perform the test. The pre-analytical or post-analytical aspects may influence in the quality of the tests. So we will evaluate the laboratory conditions, logistics, and also the layout of the result. So we will use 10 different laboratories located in the state of São Paulo. We have 4 labs in the city of São Paulo and other 6 ones in different cities throughout the state.
Our first goal is to assess the labs. So we send them a survey, a questionnaire, asking about equipment, materials, the staff, and the standardization of the protocol. After that, we need to assess the logistic aspect. It's important to determine the transportation time because there is a maximum time the material needs to be processed. I also need to assess the material used for the sampling and the level of the lab. Distance is very important because we need to control the temperature of the material. And many times, the time it takes between the place where the sample was collected and the lab where it will be processed, temperature can play a big role. the different type of tubes. It's different collecting a test in the tube that where the test will be conducted, and a different type of tube. What is the difference in terms of result? And we also have a difference in terms of the lab level. We have labs that are inside healthcare centers, so the time to conduct the test will be much shorter than a lab that will be receiving samples from a different center that might be located in a different city. A work that was recently published by the Report Group, they studied in two state capitals, Rio de Janeiro and Manaus, the implementation of the IGRA test. And they identified that temperature was one item that affected the quality of the test. So the lab is another important element here. And in this work, they were able to demonstrate that the different health clinics that send samples to these labs, this model can alter the results because the distance, the temperature, the time, and the type of transportation play a role in the result of such tests. Another important issue for the pilot project is the assessment of the layout of the results and how they are reported. We need to provide a qualitative information. The test was positive, negative, or non-determined. But we can also provide the same information.
A concentração de interferon gama que foi detectada no teste, nos tubos, que são, no caso, o TB1 e o TB2.
Different information like TB1 and TB2. What we also have in the literature shows that the level of interferon gamma has not been connected to the level of infection or to the level of the immune response or with the probability of the progression of the active disease. But this work is also interested in assessing that element. So assessing if that information together can be important for the decision-making process that physicians will make for the latent TB infection. So it is very important, and we have the expectation that the implementation of the IGRA test will cause an impact in the improvement of the lab infrastructure. But it is essential that we have an agreement in the transportation and in the scheduling plan for the material. We need to plan the acquisition of the different raw materials. We need to provide technical training to all professionals that will be part of this implementation. And we need to establish a centralized implementation plan with a decentralized approach. So in that way, we will be able to have this test so lab can develop and execute the test the best possible way without having any losses in the pre-analytic and in the post-analytical stages. So this is one example of the implementation of a test, but this model could be used for the implementation of others, because we see that especially in the public health sector, there is a great impact in terms of infrastructure and the impact that infrastructure has in the quality of the result. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I would like to thank the state programs for TB that support our lab and the program that we are conducting. And we hope that the implementation in the state of São Paulo is successful as the result of our project. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, doutora Érica.
Thank you
Explanação.
for your excellent presentation. We have already received some questions, but now moving forward on our agenda, I would like to invite Dr. Marianne Stefani, and she's going to talk about the rapid test for Hansen's disease.
Estou aqui, vamos compartilhar a tela. E sempre um estresse na hora de compartilhar a tela. Né?
Always a bit.
Não sei se vocês estão...
É a frase mais dita nos últimos 2 anos. Vocês estão me vendo e estão me ouvindo? Isso é... Você já...
Não sei se vocês já estão vendo.
Can you see my screen? I don't know if you can see it. Not yet.
Vamos ver de novo.
Let me try again.
Acho que agora vai, né?
Agora vai.
Is it working?
Só precisava tirar aqui. Então, eu quero agradecer muito.
So first, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to talk here. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this topic, which in my opinion is very important. It seemed like a dream to have some sort of rapid test for Hansen's disease, but thanks to the joint effort from many researchers and many people, we are finally getting there. First, I would like to share some data on Hansen's disease for you. Every time I went abroad to talk about Hansen's disease, people would look at me with a weird look on their face and ask me, is this disease still around? Unfortunately, it still is. Every year we have more than 200,000 new cases. Unfortunately, Brazil is the second country in the world in the number of new cases after India. And there's an interesting element in 2020, and I think this will be true for other diseases. We saw a reduction in the prevalence and in the occurrence, but unfortunately, this data reflect the impact of COVID-19 and the impact that the pandemic has had in the care provided to other diseases. And I'm sure this will be true for other conditions as well. Brazil, India, and Indonesia, they concentrate the vast majority of new reported cases of Hansen's disease in the world. It's a treatable disease since the 1980s. It's a disease caused by a bacteria, so we use a combination of antibiotics. Despite the fact that this is a very effective treatment, the prevalence is going down with no impact on the occurrence. There are 2 treatment protocols available, one with 12 doses for patients that have a higher bacillar load, and a treatment with 6 doses or 6 months for patients that have a lower load. I would like to highlight some characteristics of the disease. I think that for many years we were waiting for the right test for it, because this is a highly complex disease, a very challenging condition. So it's a chronic granulomatous disease with a very low evolution. The incubation period can take more than 10 years. It's a skin and neurological diseases that affects the skin, the nasal mucosa, and superficial peripheral nerves. I often say that Hansen's disease is actually several diseases combined. So we have loss of sensibility, of pain and heat, spots, and even manifestations with no lesions, which are purely neurological. And the late diagnosis, since this bacteria has a tropism for Schwann cells, the immune response for the infected cells destroys the ability to produce myelin. So patients lose thermal and tactile sensibility, and this late diagnosis is often followed by irreversible consequences. And the several clinical manifestations of Hansen's disease, they are associated to the immune response and to genetic characteristics as well. The mycobacterium has been described almost 150 years ago by this Norwegian physician, and it was the first pathogen associated to a human infectious disease. So different from Mycobacterium tuberculosis, it's a mandatory intracellular pathogen that replicates in macrophages and Schwann cells. The duplication time is extremely low, around 14 days, and it duplicates in colder areas of the body, between 27 to 30 degrees Celsius. Another complicating factor is that Mycobacterium leprae has never been cultivated in an exenic medium. So that has limited the offer of antigens for the development of diagnosis tests. The transmission takes place mainly through airways, the upper airways. So if you live with an untreated patient, you are at a greater risk of developing the disease. There are different animals like this armadillo in the United States that are also hosts, but in Brazil, the transmissions happen mainly due to untreated patients. This is the only mycobacteria that infects the Schwann cells, and the consequence of these infections, the immune response ends up destroying these cells and their ability to produce myelin. That's why patients lose sensibility. It's a disease that has a very strong social stigma because it deforms the hands and leads to irreversible physical inabilities due to the progressive neural damage caused in the Schwann cells. We have bone reabsorption. Patients with a late diagnosis can present different levels of loss of physical ability. And Hansen's disease diagnosis is based in clinical signals and symptoms, which requires a lot of expertise from physicians in order to do a differential diagnosis with other skin diseases that might be mistaken for Hansen's disease. So besides the different lesions on the skin, besides the loss of thermal and pain sensibility, we can have the thickening of the nerval stems, and patients might not present a single lesion in their skin and still suffer from Hansen's disease. We have complementary lab tests that are not part of the lab routine in the public health system, like the bacilloscopy, which has a very good specificity, but the sensibility depends a lot on how the test is conducted and on the pathological study, if granulomes were present in all the samples. But it's an invasive test as well that requires the collection of material, being conducted by a highly trained professional. Hansen's disease, like I said, it can be many diseases in one. Patients can have just a single lesion, like in this picture, or patients can have their whole body covered in lesions with multiple bacillus. Luckily, we can say that 95% of the population is resistant to M. leprae even after exposure. There is a spontaneous cure and people do not develop the disease. When people develop the Hansen's disease, they can have one of several types. This is a classification for research purposes. So in one extreme, we have patients with an immune response that's very high, without antibodies and very low bacillus. And in the other end of this spectrum, we have patients with response with regulator Th2 cells that produce a lot of antibodies. So the serology can be applied for patients that are in this end of the spectrum. They don't have cellular immunity, but they have humoral immunity. So when we talk about serology, we are talking about patients that have a high bacillar load that are producing antibodies. It was interesting to see in the previous presentation that because for many years we worked with tests to detect the cell immunity, like the IGRA test that is used for tuberculosis. We test several antigens and recombinant proteins, and we had a dream. The Ministry of Health actually ordered this study. We needed a rapid test that would detect some kind of biomarker for cell immunity for patients that are on this portion of the spectrum and detect antibodies simultaneously. This was not possible because all biomarkers associated to the cell immunity that were identified in patients with a low bacillar load, patients that were not treated also had the same biomarkers. So different antigens, different biomarkers, but we could not tell apart a patient that different types of patients from patients that were not being treated. So the pulsibacillar patients are treated with up to 6 doses of the therapy, and the multibacillars are treated with multiple doses for 12 months.
So in 2001, we've had the decodification of the genome, Mycobacterium leprae, and then new antigens were identified. There was a work together with Adri, coordinated by Stephen Whitten in the United States, testing different proteins, recombinant proteins. Some antigens were more promising than others, but we still keep on working with the PGL1. This is an antigen that was described over 40 years ago. It's a specific antigen, specific of the wall of M. leprae, and the antigenic part has terminal substances that characterize this antigen. And since it's a sugar, the antibodies produced are mainly IgM, IgG, and IgA, but serological tests are based on the detection of these anti-PGL1 antigens. So this is the best biomarker for serology of Hansen's disease. It detects the vast majority of multibacillary patients, and paucibacillary patients have a negative or weak serology, so we do not have biomarkers for them yet. Several studies evaluated the application of serology to classify pauci and multibacillary patients because their treatments are different. To identify also the contacts with high risk of illness, to monitor the therapy, and to help with the differential diagnosis between Hansen's disease and other diseases. The native PGL1, which is a phenoglycolipid, since we do not have the way to cultivate the bacteria, there are several synthetic or semi-synthetic forms that have been used to make the diagnosis. Sometimes they use bovine albumin, And Dr. Samira Buher conducted her PhD in Holland, and she conducted her PhD with PGL1. She developed a deep stick, but it took 2 hours to read it. So later on, Dr. Burer developed a quick test, an ML flow anti-PGL1 test. So the antibodies reflect the bacillary load. So these are indirect biomarkers of the multibacillary infection. These patients, the multibacillary ones, are the most important in the transmission chain. So at UFG, at the university, we have a platform for production of quick tests, and we have been able to produce these tests for several research groups in a very reasonable quantity, but within specific research projects. So the question is, what would be the application of serology for Hansen's disease at the public healthcare system, SUS? To search patients undetected, which are the patients at more risk of illness. So to find new cases and having a test to do that, it can also help the multibacillary disease diagnosis, decrease the delay or a late diagnosis and the risk of deformities related to the diagnosis. And the serology is also helpful to select contacts with the high risk of illness, especially regarding the multibacillary form, and also possible candidates for chemoprophylaxis after exposure. In a way, it's the offering of a test can empower the healthcare provider. So regarding the strategy of the Ministry of Health, with a zero goal strategy, the disease has been, this Hansen's disease, zero infection, zero disease, and zero stigma, this has been postponed several times. So between 2021, 2025, we aim at the optimized use. We aim for prophylaxis post-exposure. And between 2026 and 2030, we plan to implement new tools, including the diagnosis test. The best one that we have right now is the serology anti-PGL1, and new vaccines have been tested as well. So in this strategy towards zero Hansen's disease, this global strategy, by 2030, we want to increase prevention, detection of cases, detect new cases, increase chemoprophylaxis, detect cases in target populations, and test the use of new vaccines. So to control Hansen's disease and its complications and prevent new comorbidities or deformities, sorry, and detect early cases. So the delay in detection is shown by the high proportion of patients that are diagnosed with some sort of physical disability. So within that proposal of the Ministry of Health and the coordination of surveillance of diseases, we've had a project funded to develop and apply quick tests that are easy to use, that might be incorporated in the healthcare system. the Federal University of Goiás and Dr. Samira Boer signed a contract with BioClin Laboratories to transfer the technology of production of the ML flow test to detect antibodies. In August, BioClin Laboratories obtained the authorization of the test at Anvisa. So this process is right now at CONITEC for the approval. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I'm available for questions. Thank you so much.
Nós é quem agradecemos, né, a sua palestra, doutora. E a gente
We
também...
thank you for your presentation, Dr. Marianne. Thank you so much. And we would like to move on and hand over to Dr. Daniela Soares to talk about the test of HIV and syphilis. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank the organization of the event for inviting me for this incredible event. It's been an honor to share information in this event. I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes to have my presentation on.
Então, estão dando continuidade, né, à mesa que trata das incorporações tecnológicas no SUS e o que esperar.
So considering the technological incorporations in SUS and what to expect for 2022, I would like to present the results of the duo test for HIV and syphilis that was approved by the Ministry of Health. I work at an institution called Evandro Chagas. It's a science and technology facility located in the state of Pará and linked to the Ministry of Health. We conduct investigations in tropical medicine and environment. The goal of our project was to evaluate the applicability of the rapid tests for a simultaneous diagnosis of HIV and syphilis. We designed the research based on a protocol, on an international protocol of a multi-center clinic-based study. It was a descriptive and analytical and transversal study. We complied with all good practices. The PAHO also evaluated the study. We conducted training of the field and laboratory teams. We also created communication material. So we went to field after the lockdown and we had about 3 months of work on the field. We conducted all training of the teams, a review of the forms to insert everything in the database, and we also created an image bank and dealt with all the issues of managing the project so that we had all the phases mapped. The project wanted to answer 3 questions. What is the performance of rapid tests for syphilis HIV in a real-life scenario? Is the simultaneous rapid test would be accepted by SUS users? We've seen in previous panels that the Ministry of Health has different points of access and has a policy of increasing the access of rapid tests, but right now the tests are presented in individual devices, so the user of our healthcare system can choose if they want to be tested for HIV or syphilis or other diseases. And we also wanted to understand what would be the receptivity, how the healthcare providers would receive this new platform if it were to be incorporated. Because there are also structured policies, online platforms for training, and an external quality evaluation of these professionals that deal with rapid tests in Brazil.
Regarding acceptability, we conducted a study with 419 pregnant women that were being seen in health clinics in the city of Belém for their prenatal appointments. We talked to 56 men that have sex with other men in a different healthcare facility and 77 sex workers in actions that we conducted with the support of the city department of Belém. We knew that the syphilis and HIV prevalence in the city of Belém was extremely high. Among the communication materials that we developed, we have this one that supported our acceptability study because initially it allowed us to differentiate for the volunteers all the different entrances that people had in the healthcare facilities, the moment they went to the lab and the moment they returned to the healthcare service facility to receive the results and the treatment if that was the case. The second process is the process that we have today in the different health clinics in Brazil, which is testing that is conducted during the appointment, but with individual testing devices, one for syphilis and one separate one for HIV. And patients can choose if they will test for both or not. And the process of the research we did, it was a very similar process to what we had before, but with a simultaneous testing where, in this case, patients could not choose. So our target audience, pregnant women, the vast majority were up to 24 years old with an average income of up to 2,000 reais per month. And they shared this income with around 5 people in the family. They were non-white, with a high school education. They were heterosexual, usually living with their partners. And what we noticed, because the questionnaire also allowed us to know different behaviors from these people. So the group of pregnant women didn't have much knowledge about the prevention and the transmission of syphilis and HIV. That includes the possibility of vertical transmission. And they have very little knowledge on the prevention strategies that are already available today in Brazil, which is PEP, PrEP, and the self-test. For the second group, the group of men who have sex with other men, the division between young men and adults, young men up to 24 years old and adults up to 48 years old, was equal. Their income was higher than 2,000 reais. The majority was single. They had an upper education, and they did have knowledge on prevention and the transmission of these diseases, except knowledge on vertical transmission. And they were also aware about access to PEP, PrEP, and the self-test. The sex worker group had a profile of young people and adults with an income that was lower than 2,000 reais. They had the lowest education level in comparison to the other groups. They only had elementary school. The majority would declare themselves straight or heterosexuals or bisexuals, and they were aware about the transmission and the prevention of syphilis and HIV, but they had little knowledge on PEP, PrEP, and the self-test. However, overall, all three groups, the group of pregnant women, men who have sex with other men, and sex workers, they said that they accepted the rapid test format. They even preferred it to the lab tested because it's more convenient. Talking about the test itself, the test that was assessed, the possibility of doing a simultaneous test for HIV and syphilis, more than 80% from each group said they would accept this simultaneous test and they wouldn't mind that they weren't able to choose between doing one test or the other. And we asked further questions to learn more about what would make them test more often or make them get tested more often. So the group of pregnant women said that if they didn't need to be cut many times, they would test more often. Or if blood didn't need to be drawn, they would test more often. They would test more for the maximum number of diseases. And if they didn't have to wait more than 30 minutes. More than 40% of pregnant women also said that if the appointments could be scheduled faster, they would also get tested more frequently, and that they would like to be tested at home and without the use of needles, and that represents around 23% of them. The second group, the group of men who have sex with other men, I would like to highlight that they would also test more often if there wasn't the need to use a needle. They also like to get tested for the maximum number of diseases at once. They also would like to wait up to 30 minutes, but they would like to have access to the tests in campaigns that are organized or in different events that are hosted on the street, and if they had the possibility of being tested at home or in their workplaces. For the sex workers group, I would like to highlight that the time they needed to wait was important. They would like to wait up to 30 minutes only. And especially for the group of pregnant women and sex workers, they said the same thing. We arrive at the health clinic too early, we go through the triage, we do the test, and when we have to wait for a long time for the results, that is really tiresome because many of them have to go back to work and there were other issues associated to that. But the sex workers would also get tested more often if we had more testing campaigns available and if they had quicker access to self-tests. We also discussed the usability of the tests. In this case, we assessed the health professionals that actually execute the rapid tests in the healthcare services in the city of Belém. So we talked to 138 health professionals in different points of cares, and that includes maternity wards, emergency rooms, and outpatients, clinics, among others. Basically, they received the kit, the box with the kit. The kit that we assessed is called SEG Bioline, or HIV Syphilis Dual from Abbott. Just as a side comment, the project wanted to assess two other products from different manufacturers, Kimbio and Medilabson. But in the moment the research was conducted, these two manufacturers didn't have tests available. And we only had products available from Abbott. And in a number that was a little bit below the number we needed. But going back to the results, the health professionals, they received the kit and they had to handle each part of the kit, the instructions for use, the solution, all the different devices. In this study, we assessed all the products that were provided by the manufacturer, but they're not necessarily the same that are part of the kit. And this change was because this part of the kit has already been standardized by the Ministry of Health. And the health professionals also watched a video with instructions of use provided by the manufacturer. So after this initial contact, they conducted the test in their peers. So one health professional did the test in another health professional, and then they answered the research questionnaire. What was the profile of the health professionals that participated? Around 57% had a technical level of education. They were already conducting tests for over a year, 30% of them. These professionals stated that they were trained in the health care clinic. They were trained by more experienced colleagues, and the vast majority, around 90%, didn't know about the online training platform called Telelab, which is a platform developed by the Ministry of Health, and there you can find training on the use of all the materials that are part of the public health system. And they also said that they didn't know about another strategy from the Ministry of Health, which is the external quality assessment, which is a program where health professionals receive a proficiency panel and can conduct a self-assessment. May I continue? Talking about the usability of the dual test, the vast majority thought that the test was easy to understand, the instructions on the inlet, the instructions of use, and the video. It was easy to open the package of the device and to handle the different materials as well as the solution. And it was also easy to read and interpret the results. So from all these parameters, the one that had the lowest evaluation was the use of the pipette, but almost 80% of this group considered that it was easy. And then we also asked the health professionals if they thought that any user from the public health system would stop getting tests if only the dual tests were available. And the majority, 90%, answered no. Patients would not stop getting tested. And then we asked if them, as health professionals, what would they prefer to do? To work with a single test or with simultaneous test devices? And the majority, more than 80%, answered that they preferred to work with a simultaneous testing device. And they reported many reasons for that. Faster time of service, the availability of storage space, and the purchase of these materials would also be easy. Regarding the accuracy of the tests, meaning assessing the specificity, the sensibility, and the positive predictive value and the negative predictive value of the tests, we drew blood with vein puncture. We took this material for the Evandro Chagas Institute to conduct the gold standard tests on the samples. And basically what we did was to do a blind and independent comparison between the teams. And the rapid test, we also collected samples from it in the moment of the appointment, and these results were verified by 2 people in the team. So in terms of accuracy assessment, these are the results I would like to highlight regarding syphilis. Because we know from the literature that the standards for these tests have already been assessed in other countries, and the results that we have available in the literature are also results that are more agreeable to HIV and less for syphilis. But what we see here, thinking about the data that WHO has pre-qualified for this specific test, I just would like to highlight that we assessed a test in a real-world scenario, a test that had already been pre-qualified by WHO for syphilis, with a sensibility of 87% and a specificity of 99.5%. This pre-qualification work already ensures the purchase of this material, especially in countries that lack an infrastructure of regulatory work. But we also assessed all the different standards published by the Ministry of Health of Brazil. For syphilis, that means a sensibility of 94.5% and a specificity of 93%. So when we look at the data from the dual test for syphilis, in comparison to the gold standard test that we delivered the FDA BS, because it's also a trypanemic test, we saw that the sensibility was 93.95%, much higher than the sensibility that was observed in the WHO assessment, but a little bit lower than what is recommended for individual tests by the Ministry of Health. And that is true for all 3 groups. The accuracy or the global assessment of the test was pretty high, more than 99% for syphilis. I just would like to reinforce that all the parameters assessed for HIV were 100% for all the parameters. And when we assessed the kappa index, we were able to identify an almost perfect ratio between the 3 groups. So this demonstrates that in terms of accuracy, the performance was satisfactory. So, in conclusion, we conducted this investigation on usability, acceptability, and accuracy. Acceptability was really high. The usability that was perceived by health professionals was also pretty high. So from the perspective of users and health professionals, the test would be well accepted. The accuracy level is satisfactory, which would allow us to incorporate and include these tests in a public policy strategy. However, this work needs to be well aligned because we also observed a lack of knowledge on the prevention strategies that are available. So as more tests become available, we also need to inform this population so they can access healthcare services. And they will do that once they get a better understanding of the risks associated to these diseases. At the same time, we need to invest and think about new communication strategies for the Telelab platform and for the external quality assessment program, so we can keep all these services happening.
So to answer the question, what to expect from technological incorporations at SUS, we conducted an event on September 17 and debated a lot with all our business partners in the city of Belém, and also through video conference with the technical staff from the Ministry of Health. And I think Alison mentioned yesterday that the Ministry of Health will include simultaneous platforms for the diagnosis of HIV syphilis. The initial purchase will be of about 4 million tests, and the application will happen during a prenatal appointments. We normally start a project trying to answer to 1 or 2 questions, but we conduct the project, answer the questions, and get even more questions throughout the process. So one of the things that we have thought a lot about after our activities on the field is that when we look at the life cycle of a technology for health, from basic research, prototypes to implementation, when we get to the use of the technologies, we have to invest so that the whole previous effort on research is actually used. So at the Evandro Chagas Institute, we will incorporate in our research line the idea of design of services to incorporate these technologies at the public healthcare system using management tools so that we can design better this experience journey for both manufacturers, users, and managers, so that we're able to provide more access and health to our population. With that, I would like to thank you again for having me, congratulate the organization of the event, and I would like to thank the whole team working on this project. We have worked about 12 hours a day during the implementation. I would like to thank all the volunteers, all the participants. Again, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Daniela. It was a very interesting talk. And moving on, I would like to move over to Dr. Pamela Gaspar, who will talk about chlamydia and gonorrhea. Good evening, or good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and share this panel with such great professionals. It's been very interesting to watch this event with such interesting debates. Are we good to go? Okay. So in order to answer the question about technological incorporations in SUS, I will talk a little bit about chlamydia and gonorrhea. So I would like to highlight that chlamydia and gonorrhea are STIs that, when untreated, can cause severe consequences to the patients, leading to even infertility. So these are diseases that really are considered very important in terms of public health. So that's why we put a lot of effort to incorporate the diagnostic tests in the routine. Before talking about these tests in SUS, I would like to talk a little bit about the background and how we got there. Considering all the technology that we use, it has to be registered at Anvisa, but there has to be an interest to be used in the public healthcare system routine. And then CONITEC will evaluate the efficacy, the accuracy, the safety of the technology, and also there will be an economic assessment comparing to other existent technologies in the system. So right at the end of this path, we will have the result, if it's a positive result, to incorporate this technology in the public healthcare system. So what is the scenario for chlamydia? In 2008, the test was incorporated. It was a test by hybrid capture. This has been present since 2008, and it did not include gonorrhea or other molecular biology technologies. So with time and technology advancements, new tests became available on the market. First, including chlamydia and gonorrhea without changing costs, and also used nucleic acid and not only hybrid capture. With that, we are able to improve the sensitivity of the tests, and examples of those are PCR, RT-PCR, and TMA. So with that, the results are presented separately if chlamydia, gonorrhea, and so on. So since 2019, we've had this technology incorporated in SUS, and we requested the change to use the molecular biology technology. This change was accepted by the system, and so we now have this procedure of conducting these tests that use molecular biology of both pathogens. So once we have this protocol following all these process of incorporation, so with that, it was able to include in the protocol, which dictates the use of this technology in SUS, we were able to include how to test and who would be able to use those tests. With that, we've had another question. After 20 years of attempts, we were able to launch the first nationwide antimicrobial susceptibility surveillance for gonorrhea in Brazil. These samples were collected in 2015-2016 in Brazil, and we observed a high resistance to penicillin and tetracycline with a high resistance to ciprofloxacin. But at that time, the national recommendation of treatment for chlamydia and gonorrhea was ciprofloxacin, because we had no enough medicines to include other treatments with CONITEC. So from there on, we were able to change to azithromycin because it has an average resistance, and ceftriaxone and cefixime had a high sensitivity. So then we changed the treatment to ceftriaxone and azithromycin. So this shows that it is important to test for gonorrhea due to the issue of gonorrhea. And then we've had the case in London in 2018, which was considered the worst gonorrhea case in the world. And after that, several others were diagnosed. So the world was actually at alert regarding the disease. And so in 2018, we presented the results of these studies and how we incorporated the surveillance in SUS and the challenges that we faced in the World and European Congress of the Appliance of Science. We had the political opportunity window for diagnosis, this policy window that I call it PrEP. So PrEP was a subject in the world, and so people asked me if we had the traceability of these patients of gonorrhea and chlamydia, and so we showed that we had all this project, but it seemed that that success that we presented was kind of doomed because we were not looking to STIs. Of course, we were looking, but we did not have effective actions. So when we talk about the incorporation of technology, we can talk about that since 2008. A lot of people have been fighting for that. There was a change of the procedure to use molecular biology. There was a guideline recommendation to use these PCDT-IST tests. And so the patient of London, all of that together created a commitment for us to try to incorporate this technology in our routine through a centralized acquisition, procurement, and centralized management together with all entities in Brazil. That's why we decided to implement the test pilots for chlamydia and gonorrhea in SUS. It includes the tracing of asymptomatic people and diagnostics of symptomatic people. Results are not issued right away, but these tests are very important for patients when they come back for a return to see if the treatment was for a current infection, if there's persistence or resistance, to refer treatment for a sexual partner or detect other microorganisms that can generate the same symptoms. What is the strategy of this pilot? To understand the dynamic of implementation of these molecular biology tests and estimate the demand for future procurement, both in municipal, state, and national levels. Up from 2018, when this technology was incorporated, this procedure changed to include all molecular biology technologies. And these guidelines provide this traceability of asymptomatic people as well as symptomatic patients. This pilot implementation has today at least one laboratory in each state. In some states with more inhabitants, like São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Rio Grande do Sul, they have more than one laboratory. 100,000 tests, Abbott real-time CT and G were procured, we were already using the capacity already existent for HIV. And that's another challenge for SUS, because for each disease, a new lab has to be installed and has to share the same staff and the same facility. So we're trying to use the existing technology in SUS because the pieces of equipment have the capacity to do so. So the biological samples are urine, vaginal and endocervical swab. And these are examples of the series of actions that we are conducting. A lot of initiatives have been necessary when we talk about the incorporation of a new technology in our routine. So several documents had to be registered. Several meetings were conducted with state coordinators and laboratories. We also collected samples, had the coordination with logistics, provided online training about sampling because this was a new procedure in SUS, and we've been providing support and are almost in daily contact with the network. We have also conducted a webinar to raise awareness of the clinical professionals about the importance of this test. We want to shift the paradigm of why do I need to test if the antibiotic is much more cheaper. But what about resistance? What about super treatments? Or if you do not treat, what has to be treated? So all these issues were approached during this webinar together with the Brazilian Society of STIs. All videos of training sessions and webinars are available online.
So what were the challenges that we faced in including these new technology? Well, the tests that were acquired are not validated for extragenital swabs. And they would be very important because these are areas that are also infected in the body, especially by gonococcus. And the pharynges is an area that develops resistant strain. So it is very important to swab these areas as well. The primary tube for the collection of urine is not part of the kit. The tube that's on the kit is only for storage. And the logistics of sending materials for different locations is quite challenging because we should send the cold materials to the lab from the health department, and that is a huge challenge. There was also the need to create a new local organization, provide training for different professionals, and define the different flows. And every time you need to change a process, that it's always a challenge to do that. The work overload in the laboratory professionals, because that's one more thing that they have to do in their daily routines. How difficult it is to request tests and to see the results, so challenges associated to the information system, and the need to raise awareness among managers, health professionals, and the population to get tested for chlamydia and gonorrhea. So what can we expect from the future? We hope that the results from the pilot project will be satisfactory, and they will reinforce the need for creating this final network, together with the network we have for HIV, hepatitis C, hepatitis B, which is managed by the Ministry of Health and by the Department of STIs, which I belong to, a shared acquisition between all three spheres of government. And maybe besides using genital samples, we can use extragenital samples. What we hope for the future, and these are ongoing strategies, by the way, is that we can use the etiology from male urethral samples. So maybe we could, there's another front of this project, which is collecting samples to do molecular biology to detect several pathogens, to understand the etiology of these samples in Brazil. And for those samples that we detect a specific organism, we can assess for resistance, because this is another challenge of a pathogen that is developing antimicrobial resistance. Another ongoing action we have is the creation of the pilot network for the detection of chlamydia, gonorrhea, TB, and MG. So the idea is to determine the prevalence of these 4 pathogens in pregnant women that are doing the prenatal appointments in the public health service, because they can serve as a proxy for the overall population, according to WHO. So with that information, we can try to incorporate the technology associated to these other diseases that are still not part of the public health system. And finally, for future pilot strategies, we can use rapid molecular tests to expand access to this technology, and it has been demonstrated throughout the event. Yesterday, José talked about this, and other colleagues also touched on that point today. We have to have a more etiological approach, so maybe we can assess resistance and provide the best treatment according to that result. Self-sampling is also an important strategy, and telemedicine, because with COVID, it has been demonstrated that this is a necessity for the public health system. That is what I had to share with you. Thank you very much, and I'm available if you have questions.
Perfeito, muito obrigado, doutora Pamela.
Thank you, Dr. Pamela. I'm sorry, I think his connection is a little bit unstable. I cannot hear him.
A palavra está com você.
Now, I would like to invite Dr. José Eduardo Levi to talk about HPV. The floor is yours. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Agora estamos ouvindo sim.
Yes, we can hear you now. Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to talk about HPV.
Conseguem ver minha tela, né?
You can see my presentation, right?
Sim. Tá bem.
Perfect. So my name is José Eduardo Levi. I'm a biologist. I have a PhD in virology, and I work in the University of São Paulo researching HPV. I have been doing that for more than 30 years. And it's a pleasure to talk to you about the possibility of incorporating the HPV test in the public health system in Brazil. These are my disclosures.
E, bem, a Organização Mundial da Saúde
WHO recently established a target to eliminate cervix cancer. And the target is that by 2030, all signatory countries would have reached the 90-70-90 goal. So 90% of girls under 15 are already vaccinated. 90% of women with lesions and cervix cancer are receiving treatment or have been treated, and 70% of women at the screening age have already done at least 2 screening tests in their lives, one by the age of 35 and the other by the age of 45. These are the commitments we have made for 2030. WHO in 2018 published a list of essential tests that every person should access in their lives to complement the list of essential drugs that is always published. And for the first time, an HPV test was part of this list. More recently, not only WHO have defended the use of screening for cervical cancer using the HPV test, but they also published a guideline about the implementation of this initiative in different screening programs. And a foundation of the use of HPV tests to substitute traditional screening, which is conducted in our country through a cytology test. We can see studies that were produced in the last decade, large randomized populational studies that basically compared one branch did HPV tests, the other branch did cytology, and basically they followed these women for some time and then analyzed the tests that were able to detect the highest number, the larger number of lesions, besides having other secondary targets. This is a very remarkable work by Lancet because it is the combination of the 4 major studies from these countries that has proved that an HPV-based screening promotes a much better percentage, a 60 to 70 greater percentage against cytology. And a follow-up of these women for many years have also shown that it is safe, that this testing interval could be of at least 5 years. This has proven the validity and the advantage of using an HPV test. And the strength of this approach comes from the sensibility. An HPV test has much higher sensibility than the cytology for the detection of lesions and high-degree lesions and cancer. This sensibility for cytology is around 50 to 80% when it comes to cytology. Molecular tests have a sensibility of around 90 to 99%. That would generate a reduction in the number of screening procedures like colposcopies because of lesions or that might or might not be the real lesion that would generate a cervical cancer. It also allows to increase the screening interval, and it brings automation. We don't have a subjective analysis that would depend on the training of the professional, which is quite difficult. And with that, we would be able to reach a high productivity, something that would be very difficult to achieve with cytology. And this high productivity is necessary when we think about the screening of cervical cancer. The clinical specificity is a disadvantage because the vast majority of women who test positive for HPV DNA don't have a lesion. And that makes it more difficult to use screening algorithms and to provide recommendations. So until we solved that problem, that was an issue that has delayed the acceptance of this kind of approach by the different scientific societies and by the regulatory agencies. And one thing that is always mentioned is the cost. We're going to talk more about cost later, if this is a valid point or if it is just something that is said by those who oppose the use of molecular testing in the public system. This HPV test is cost effective for screening HPV in all these countries, and it is part of every country that conducts this type of analysis. Of course, since this was done in Brazil, recently we have published a study that was conducted in the city of Indaiatuba, in the public health system of that city, with costs that were real costs from Brazil. And since we don't have the HPV test in the public health system, we created an estimate of $30, which seemed quite high to me, to be honest. This study clearly demonstrated that the HPV test has a good cost effectiveness. When the ICER is negative, it means that once the test is introduced, you will be able to save resources. And we have 2 approaches here, a purely HPV test approach and a hybrid approach with a cytology for a certain age group and HPV testing for an age group between 30 to 64, which remains with a good cost effectiveness. So it has been proven that in the Brazilian reality, the HPV test will not lead to more cost. It will actually help us save resources. And it's not just about the sensibility and the economic issues and the fact that we save lives, because these women are they're active women, they're working, they have children, they have grandchildren, they are working, and they suffer from a disease that is not only detectable, but it's preventable. It's the only human cancer that has a single cause and it can be early detected. So for that reason, many countries in the world already started replacing the cytology screening for HPV test screening. We see countries that already have national or subnational level programs. So these countries do not use cytology. Australia, Turkey, Holland, the UK, and some areas of Spain and Portugal, and in the US, Mexico, some countries in Central America, Argentina, and other countries that have started pilot studies a long time ago, like Paraguay, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, El Salvador. So all countries with a high occurrence of cervical cancer are either screening these cases with an HPV test, or they have ongoing pilot projects to do that. India is another example. It's another country with a lot of cases of cervical cancer. Let's remember that HPV is a DNA virus. And if we follow the central dogma of molecular biology, DNA, RNA, and protein, we can use the virus DNA, but we can also use the RNA or even viral proteins or cell proteins that are produced when oncogenic HPVs are affecting the cells. And for that, there are many possibilities of tests. That's tests that target the DNA, tests that amplify the RNA, and tests that detect protein like E6, E7, or cell proteins that marks the oncogenic proteins from HPV. The DNA-based tests have the highest clinical sensibility, which gives us the biggest negative predictive factor. Protein-based tests, they have a better clinical specificity, so a better positive predictive value. So we have to work with these two pieces of information, because every time we are talking about screening, what we want is to have the best negative predictive value. When I say that a woman doesn't have cervical cancer, they don't have it and they can come back in 5 years. When I say that that woman has cervical cancer, that might be true or not, but we need more tests to prove it. So for that purpose, we create a global market, meaning all women that are at that screening age group. So that's why we have so many tests. We have 254 HPV DNA tests available. Unfortunately, the vast majority of these tests, more than 90%, do not follow the quality requirements for these HPV tests, and 81% do not have any type of study with a peer review analysis. So the message here is HPV tests, yes, they should be used, but not any test. We need validation. We need to know about the clinical experience behind the use. So when I say that cytology, we shouldn't use it, it's useless, that's not true. It should be reassessed. Some algorithms that are already being used for countries that have HPV tests for screening. In the US, they do the test. If it's negative, women come back in 5 years. If it's positive for some type of the high-risk HPV, that sample goes through a cytology, so a test with a more sensibility and then a test with a higher specificity. If the cytology comes back normal, that person comes back in a shorter period of time. And if the 16, 18 is positive, we go directly for colposcopy because of the high positive predictive value. So we don't do a cytology in that case. Holland is a little bit more conservative. They combine all this in a single result that is then sent to cytology, that is a cytology that is repeated after 6 months when positive.
So the introduction of the HPV test does not eliminate cytology, but it makes cytology a better test. So this is a job being conducted in the Public Healthcare Center in São Paulo, in one of the largest centers for SUS, where the use of cytology without and with prior knowledge of HPV status. So we can see that the detection of high-level lesions was much higher with prior knowledge of HPV than without. One other thing that I would like to highlight is why to make this differentiation of the genotypes, because they are very different. So for example, HPV 16 has a accumulated risk in 16 years. It's a woman with positive HPV 16 has a much higher risk, a 75% risk. These are also women that have high risk as well, HPV 5 and 6, but present less risk a long time. The Indaiatuba study conducted in Indaiatuba used colposcopy with HPV 16 or 18 positive, and this is already implemented in the public health system. So this proves that we want to use this type of test. It's desirable. In our experience, in a study conducted with 16,000 women, the frequency of HPV genotypes are half of the frequency. When we look at the cytology rate, we can see the oncogenicity of these HPV tests. And with this transversal study, these women that had these types of HPV did not have this cytology rate. So there's a less need of screening. And to close, after the learnings with COVID-19, we have a high capacity installed in the country. And so with the elimination of COVID-19, we will have use or no use for all these machines. And so the biggest demand that we have in the public healthcare system in Brazil to use molecular biology equipment is to screen cervical cancer. This is a high demand, the only high demand that I can see today in the public health system. We could also introduce improvements that we learned from COVID. For example, the tests without the need of extraction, since swabs, cervical vaginal swabs, are similar to oropharyngeal swabs that we use for COVID. So with that, the HPV-based screening is desirable, is cost-effective, it improves the quality of life of these women and anticipates a preventive treatment, it cures, and it's economic for the public health system. The fact that it will not be implemented in 2022, but chlamydia and gonorrhea, yes. I congratulate Pamela on doing that, but that is not backed by WHO or other health entities. It's not because of economic issues. We have to find out why is there such a resistance for an important change for our country, which is a country with high occurrence of cervical cancer, which is a shame for our country. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Muito obrigado, Dr. José Eduardo.
Thank you so much, Dr. José Levi. It was a very interesting presentation. We are almost out of time. So if we have any questions that have been sent for our speakers, they will be available on our website and will be answered later on. So right now, I would like to thank all the speakers for their presentations. And I would like to highlight that each talk had similarities with others. When we talked about stability of the sample, the time of transport of the sample to the laboratory, this is a very important aspect that was mentioned during the TB presentation. When we talked about Hansen's disease, it's very interesting that it was a test developed in our country. And I would also highlight that that should be more published, broadcast about the accuracy of the test. Another important point is the perspective of the user. We pay attention to the technical aspects, but the acceptance of the patient and the staff and everything regarding a change of an equipment or device is very important when the test is closer to the patient. Dr. Pamela also talked about the difficulty of working on that, on the access and acceptance. And just like Dr. José Levy mentioned, there is another dimension regarding prevention, which relates to these tests. So I think all the presentations kind of complemented each other. And it was an honor to be a moderator for this event. I would like to thank everyone who sent questions, but due to a lack of time, we won't be able to answer them live. They will be available on the CBDL website. I would like to thank Dr. Carlos Gouveia for inviting us and for having me as a moderator of this panel. Thank you so much, and let's move on with our agenda. Thank you.